The second deadly sin we're going to look at is greed, and then its opposite, which is generosity. So firstly, greed. The Oxford Dictionary defines greed as an insatiate longing, especially for wealth. Vine's Expository Dictionary says under greediness, see covetousness. And under covetousness it says to long for, to lust after, to covet. And it's also linked with envy. And so we see immediately that this second deadly sin is closely associated with two others, lust and envy, and with the last of the 10 Commandments, you shall not covet, in Exodus 20 verse 17. And there's therefore several different ways that we can look at greed. It's longing for things unnecessarily, it's lusting after them unhealthily, and futilely coveting what others have and we don't. As the Oxford Dictionary says, it's particularly to do with wealth and possessions. On the other hand, excessive greed for sex or food or drink and so on have their own special words. As mentioned in the introduction, greed is the only one of the original 7 deadly sins that a cross-section of today's society voted to keep on a new updated list. And so it seems modern secular wisdom only agrees with the ancient version on one of the original deadly sins. Maybe it's because it's the only one that is seen as being both common in our society and also detrimental to it. Even in today's environment of tolerance and acceptance of almost anything and everything, people still agree that being greedy is a problem and should be condemned. As already said, there are several different forms of greed, of which there are 3 obvious ones. Firstly, greed for money and possessions as symbols of success. And secondly, greed for money and possessions for fear of falling into poverty. And thirdly, greed for money and possessions for their own sake. The first form of greed is a means to an end, as a symbol of success. The main problem is the desire to impress others and to achieve status in their eyes rather than the greed itself. Vast wealth and expensive material possessions are perceived by many as proving that the person who owns them is important. We only have to look at the many celebrities in our modern culture to see the truth of this. Many people look up to those who have amassed large fortunes, as if such riches prove that they are in some way superior to them. The second form of greed stems from fear. That's the fear of falling into poverty. People hoard more than they need for the fear of running out. They're less generous than they could be for fear of not having enough left for themselves at some time. They're more concerned with their own comfort and well-being at the expense of considering the needs of others. Such a form of greed can always be justified as prudence, and perhaps therefore it's more difficult to avoid or even to identify as a problem than the first one. And then thirdly, there's greed for its own sake. People collect material possessions for their own sake. There are so many collectibles on the market today, the variety is seemingly endless. Aggressive advertising increases the desire to have more and more things, and so many of us end up with far more possessions than we actually know what to do with. We can end up being a slave to our own possessions. Again, it's so easy to justify owning such possessions as either necessary or useful or aesthetically pleasing, or finally and worst of all, that why not I deserve it reason. Most likely all of us suffer from indulging in one form of greed or another, whether we realise it or not. What does the Bible say? As we would expect, there's many passages that condemn greed, and some of them give reasons for doing so, while others suggest how we should behave instead. Proverbs 15 verse 27 says, "A greedy man brings trouble to his family, but he who hates bribes will live." The verse doesn't explain what sort of trouble a person's greed will bring to his family, but it's clear that a greedy person is far more likely to succumb to bribery than one who isn't. Being greedy not only affects an individual, it also affects those closest to him. And therefore, if we're concerned about others, and particularly those closest to us, we need to concentrate on controlling our greed. Peter told the elders that they should not be greedy for money, but eager to serve, in 1 Peter 5 verse 2. Here they're told that not only what not to be, but how they should behave instead. Being greedy for money is selfish and self-indulgent. Being eager to serve others is the opposite. It's wanting to help others, sometimes at our own expense. Passages in both Ephesians and Colossians are very strong. They both equate greed with idolatry. Ephesians 5 verses 3 and 5 says, "But among you there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. No immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a man is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God." Colossians 3 verse 5 says, "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." Greed here is linked with sexual misbehaviour and strongly condemned in the same terms. We may be surprised at this, but it seems that God looks on lust for money and possessions in the same way to sexual lust. And therefore, if we're concerned about what God thinks of us, the next time we're tempted to hoard our money and our possessions, or add to them unnecessarily, or hope that they increase our status in the eyes of others, maybe we should stop and think whether there's an alternative course of action we should take instead. When Jesus was on earth, he regularly spoke out against the Pharisees, more so than any other group of people. And what did he say to them? "Woe to you, teachers of the law, and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence." That's Matthew 23:25. He was concerned with their hypocrisy, being one thing but pretending to be another. And what was the main thing he accused them of? Greed and self-indulgence. They enjoyed their status, their position, their self-importance, and this was largely achieved by their level of wealth and possessions. They could have used their wealth and possessions to help others if they chose, as some of them did, for example Joseph of Arimathea. But instead, the majority chose to use them to control and manipulate others to their advantage. They liked to appear super spiritual, but inside they were greedy and self-serving. Finally, the futility of greed is shown up in the parable of the rich fool in Luke 12 verses 13 to 21. A person in a crowd asked Jesus to tell his brother to divide his inheritance with him. And Jesus said, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. A man's life doesn't consist in the abundance of his possessions." It's Luke 12 verse 15. He then told a story about a rich man who spent his life accumulating wealth and possessions, but who suddenly died one night. God said to him, "You fool, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" The point is that at the end of the day, amassing wealth for ourselves is meaningless. Instead, Jesus said in Matthew 6 verses 19 to 21, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And then on to generosity. The opposite of greed is generosity. Instead of hoarding things for ourselves, a generous nature leads us to give things away to others. The Oxford Dictionary definition is magnanimous, noble-minded, not mean or prejudiced, free in giving. These are all words that we'd like to describe us, but they're difficult to live up to. They also encompass not only being generous with our money, but also being generous with our praise of others. We should be ready to give credit to others rather than crave praise for ourselves. That's easier said than done. Many Christians in particular will admit to wanting to be well thought of by others. Hearing others sing their praises is music to their ears. Generosity with our time is also important today. Where many of us in Western society today have more than enough money and possessions, we may find it easier to be generous with them than with our time. Time is precious, it said, and as Christians we should be prepared to be generous with it as well. It's all too easy to say that we haven't got time, when what we really mean is we don't really want to do whatever it is we've been asked to do. We should make time for God, for prayer and reading the scriptures, and we should make time for our husbands and wives and our children. And we should make time for our church and voluntary work. And after this we can then think about what is left for ourselves. However, how often is it that we go through this list in reverse order? Ourselves first, then the church activities, then our family members, and lastly God, if we have any time left over. When talking about generosity, however, the Bible only talks about generosity with money. There's relatively few verses on the subject, but those that are often mention the attitude of the giver. 2 Corinthians 9 verse 7 says, "Each man should give what is decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver." A gift given grudgingly or one that's virtually forced from someone is worth little in God's eyes. Not only is the gift itself important, but so is the attitude and the motivation of the giver. As humans, we tend not to worry so much about this, as no one can see the reasons that we do things. However, we must never forget that God can see why we do things, and he is concerned with what goes on in our minds. A good example of willing generosity is mentioned in 2 Corinthians 8 verses 2 to 4. Here, Paul commends the Macedonian churches. Out of the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. It seems they couldn't really afford to give as much as they did, and yet such was their eagerness to help others, they completely disregarded their own poverty. This really is the ultimate in generosity. Cornelius was another example of generosity. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. That's in Acts 10 verse 2. Paul gave Timothy particular instructions regarding the rich in 1 Timothy 6 verses 17 to 18. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. The rich were to be generous and willing to share. This is very applicable to many Christians living today in our society. We are all relatively rich, and so we should all be generous and willing to share with those that are less well off than ourselves. Who we choose to be the recipients is less important. What's most important is our attitude, and that we do actually give some of our wealth away. What about the Old Testament prosperity gospel, as it's called? Lastly, we should just note that there's a number of verses that mention generosity in the Old Testament and link it with prosperity. For example, Psalm 112 verse 5 says, "Good will come to him who is generous and lends freely." And Proverbs 11 verse 24 says, "One man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty." And Proverbs 22 verse 9 says, "A generous man will himself be blessed, for he shares his food with the poor." These verses and many like them have led to what is known as the prosperity gospel, where people who are well off are credited with being so, partly as a result of living a good Christian life. In other words, the Lord has blessed them with riches because they have lived good lives. However, without exception, these promises were given to the people of Israel, where they would be blessed by God if they lived according to his laws, and would be judged if they didn't, as it says in Deuteronomy 28. However, it's not good theology to take such verses today and assume that as a result of being generous, God will repay such deeds with even more wealth, And nor is it a good theology to assume that any wealthy Christian must be wealthy because they live a good life. It's far more likely to be the result of living in the affluent West in the 21st century.